That was the first thing people remembered afterward. Not what he said. Not even the look on his face, but the fact that he walked into the middle of a public gathering and pointed his finger at a woman who had buried her husband less than a year ago. And he didn't knock, didn't wait, didn't hesitate for even half a second. That woman, he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, is living in Gideon Rourke's house, sleeping under his roof, and not one of you has the spine to say what that means. Clara Whitmore was standing near the back wall. She had Eli's hand in hers. The boy was 6 years old, and he didn't fully understand what was happening, but children always understand tone, and he pressed himself against his mother's leg and went very still. Nobody spoke. Ezekiel let the silence do its work. We built this settlement on decent values, he continued, moving slowly through the crowd like a man who had rehearsed this moment many times. And I will not stand here and pretend I don't see what's right in front of me. Clara did not look away from him. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were steady. But her hand, the one holding Eli's, was trembling, and she pressed it flat against her thigh so no one would notice. If you were standing in that room, if you felt that silence pressing down on you from every direction, if you saw a man use his position and his voice to turn an entire town against a widow who had nearly frozen to death 3 months earlier, what would you have done? Would you have spoken? Or would you have stayed quiet the way most people do and told yourself it wasn't your place? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Stories like Clara's are exactly what this channel is built for. Real human courage, real human failure, and the moments in between that change everything. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a like if you want more, and leave a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that room, you need to understand what happened 3 months before it. The winter that came to Red Hollow that year was not a gentle one. It arrived without warning in the second week of November, a wall of gray, nothing that rolled down from the northern ridges and swallowed the valley whole before anyone had time to prepare. By morning, the drifts were chest high against the south-facing walls. By the following afternoon, they were taller than that, the kind of cold that didn't just chill a person, it pressed into them. Slow and deliberate, like it was looking for something specific to break. Clara Whitmore had known this winter was coming. She'd known it the way you know things when there's no one left to hide the truth from plainly, without comfort. Her husband Thomas had died 11 months earlier from a fever that moved too fast for the settlement's one doctor to slow down. He'd left her the cabin, the land, $43 in a tin beneath the floorboards, and a debt to the general store that she'd been chipping away at since spring. She hadn't told anyone how bad it was. That was the part she would be ashamed of later, not the poverty itself, but the pride that surrounded it like a wall. She'd grown up in a family where asking for help was something close to a confession of failure, and even with Thomas gone and Eli growing, and the woodpile shrinking faster than she could replenish it, she had not once walked up to a neighbor's door and said the words out loud. She told herself she was managing. She told herself spring was not far. She was lying, and on some level she knew it. By the third morning of the blizzard, the firewood was gone. Not almost gone. Clara had fed the last split log into the stove before dawn and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to it burn down, calculating time the way desperate people do, trying to figure out how long the residual heat would hold before the cold came back. Eli was asleep beside her, curled under every blanket she owned, his breathing slow and even. He didn't know yet. She hadn't told him there was no more wood, the same way she hadn't told anyone else anything. Pulled her coat on over 2 wool shirts and stood at the window. Outside, the snow was still falling. Not hard, just steady, the way it falls when it's settled in for the long haul and has no particular hurry. The trail down to the valley was completely buried. She couldn't even see where it had been. The nearest neighbor was the Harmon place, a quarter-mile east, and in this kind of snow, that quarter-mile was an entirely different world. She thought about going. She thought about bundling Eli up and pushing through it. She stood at the window for a long time, thinking about it, and did not move. That was the truth she would only admit much later. She had been so afraid of what it would mean, the asking, the explaining, the look on someone's face when they understood how badly things had gotten, that she had stood at a window and weighed that fear against her son's life. She is not a villain in this telling. She is not careless or stupid. She was a woman who had never been allowed to be helpless, who had been raised to believe that helplessness was something you kept hidden even when it was killing you. That particular belief had been stitched into her so thoroughly that she couldn't pull it out even when she needed to. The stove went cold around mid-morning. Clara lay down beside Eli and pulled the blankets over both of them. She told herself she was just keeping him warm. She told herself she would figure something out in an hour, once she'd rested. She told herself a lot of things in the quiet of that frozen cabin, and none of them were true. And some part of her knew it, and she lay there anyway, because there was nothing else to do. She did not light the chimney again. Gideon Rourke was not a man who noticed things easily. His foreman, a weathered Tennessean named Pell, would have told you that Gideon could walk through his own house in a state of complete preoccupation and not notice if half the furniture had been moved. He had the kind of focused attention that worked perfectly for running a cattle operation and worked considerably less well for the smaller, domestic details of life. His wife Margaret had teased him about it regularly, and when she died 4 years ago, the teasing had stopped and the preoccupation had gotten worse, and Pell had quietly taken on the task of managing everything that Gideon's focus missed. Gideon noticed chimneys. It was one of those specific attentions that some people develop for no clear reason, a particular thing their eye catches that other eyes don't. Grown up in a cold winter country, and somewhere in his early life he'd learned to read smoke the way a sailor reads water. Which chimneys were burning what, at what hour, how the smoke moved it told him something. Though he couldn't always say what. He'd been watching the Whitmore cabin since Thomas died. Not in any systematic way, not out of any plan. Just the way you watch something that sits at the edge of your sightline when you're standing on the hill above the valley, the way your eye runs to a thing without being told to. He'd seen Clara's chimney smoke most mornings, since November, sometimes thin, sometimes barely a thread, but there. On the third morning of the blizzard, there was nothing. He stood on the rise above the valley and looked at the cabin for a long time. Chimney without smoke in weather like this was not an anomaly. It was an emergency. He knew that the way he knew where the fence lines ran and what a sick animal looked like from 50 yards automatically, without having to think it through. He went back inside and told Pell he was going to the Whitmore place. Pell looked at the snow coming down outside the window. In this? Yes. Pell didn't argue. He'd known Gideon Rourke for 11 years and had learned the particular tone that meant the decision was already made. He helped Gideon saddle the big roan, the one with the chest for pushing through drifts, and watched him ride out into the white. The ride took nearly 40 minutes for what should have been a 10-minute trip. The roan's was strong, and Gideon knew how to read the terrain beneath the snow, finding the subtle depressions that marked the path. But even so, it was slow and brutally cold work. His face was numb by the time he reached the cabin. He could barely feel his hands inside the gloves. He pounded on the door. Nothing. He tried the handle, frozen solid in the frame. He stepped back, measured the door once with his eyes, and put his shoulder into it. The ice cracked and the door swung inward, and the cold air that rolled out to meet him was not significantly different from the cold air outside. And that told him everything he needed to know before he even saw them. They were on the bed, both of them. Eli curled against his mother's side, the blankets piled so thick over both of them that for one terrible half-second Gideon couldn't tell if they were breathing. He crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled the blanket back from Eli's face. The boy's eyes were closed. His lips had the particular pale color that scared Gideon badly, but his chest was moving. Shallow and slow, but moving. He checked Clara, same. He had minutes, not much more. He understood that with the same cold clarity that had made him saddle the horse in the first place. He stripped off his own coat without thinking twice about the cold he was inviting in and wrapped it around Eli, then looked at Clara at the 2 wool shirts, the thin dress, the inadequate blankets, and felt something move in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was in the same neighborhood as both. He picked Eli up first, tucked him under one arm, then reached back for Clara. She stirred when he lifted her. Her voice was barely a thread. You're not fine, he said. Don't. She didn't have the strength to argue. That was how he knew it was bad Clara Whitmore. From what he'd understood of her in the 11 months since Thomas died, was not a woman who stopped arguing easily. Carried them both to the roan, which stood in the snow with the patient endurance of a good horse, and got them settled as best he could, and turned back toward the ranch. She woke up in a room she didn't recognize. That was the first thing, the wrongness of the ceiling, the particular grain of unfamiliar wood, the smell of a different kind of smoke from a different kind of fire. Then the warmth, which was so complete and so foreign after the cabin that her body didn't quite trust it. Her skin felt like it was being held too close to a flame, even though she wasn't near one. The warmth was real. She just hadn't felt it in long enough that her body had forgotten what it felt like. She sat up. Her coat was gone. Someone had put a heavy wool blanket over her and a second one beneath her, and she was on a bed with an actual rope frame and a proper mattress, and the room was warm, not just warmer than the cabin warm. The kind of warm that means there's been a real fire going for hours. Eli was in a chair beside the bed, asleep, wrapped in a coat that was not his. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them again, because closing them felt too much like what she'd been doing in the cabin, and she wasn't ready to let herself do that again so soon. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to stand up, and her legs didn't cooperate. She grabbed the bedpost and made it upright by force of will and stood there for a moment, breathing, taking stock. Her feet were wrapped in dry cloth. Her hands were stiff but functional. Her head ached with the particular deep throb of someone who has been very cold and is now not. She heard voices from somewhere below, low, male, unintelligible. She made her way to the door. The house was large. She'd known that, from the outside, you could see Gideon Rourke's ranch from most places in the valley, and you'd have to be deliberately not looking to miss the size of it. But knowing it from a distance and standing in the upstairs hallway were different things. The hallway was long. There were 3 other doors. The floors were planked hardwood, not packed dirt. At the far end, a staircase went down toward the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. She found him in the kitchen. He was standing with his back to her, pouring something into a pot, and when she appeared in the doorway, he turned without surprise, as if he'd heard her coming on the stairs and had simply waited for her to arrive. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You should be in bed. Eli is asleep and fine. I checked him 20 minutes ago. I need to go back." The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. It was reflex, the same reflex that had kept her standing at the window instead of pushing through the snow. Impulse to retreat back to the broken, cold, familiar thing, rather than stay somewhere that required her to acknowledge what had happened. Gideon set down the ladle. He turned fully to face her. He was a big man. She'd known that. Broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a kind of face that had been weathered into something settled and unreadable. He had dark eyes that were not unkind, but were not particularly gentle either. He looked like a man who had spent a long time making decisions he didn't enjoy. "The roof on your cabin has snow load I wouldn't trust," he said. "The trail is buried. There's no wood." He paused. You go back to freezing. You and the boy both. We managed before. You didn't manage. I found you not breathing. Landed somewhere it was supposed to land." She felt it, and she didn't have a good answer for it, and the not having an answer made her angrier. "I don't need your charity," she said. She could hear how it sounded even as she said it, ungrateful, brittle, The worst possible response to a man who had ridden into a blizzard to save her life. She knew how it sounded, and she said it anyway, because it was the only armor she had, and she was too rattled to reach for anything else. Gideon looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You're right," he said finally. "You don't. But that boy sleeping upstairs does. And you can think about your pride or you can think about him. One of those things matters more than the other." The silence that followed was one of the more uncomfortable of Clara's recent life, and her recent life had not been short on uncomfortable silences. "I'm not asking you to be grateful," he said, when she didn't answer. "I'm not asking you for anything. Stay until the snow clears and the trail is passable. That's all." He turned back to the pot. Clara stood in the doorway of his kitchen, in his house, in borrowed warmth she hadn't asked for, and couldn't yet bring herself to accept gracefully, and thought about Thomas, and about the cabin, and about the $43 that were probably gone now, since she'd spent the last of them on lamp oil in October. Then Eli appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes, and called down for her. "I'm here," she called back. "Come down." She didn't leave. Talk started within the week. Red Hollow was not a large settlement. Perhaps 200 souls spread across the valley and the surrounding hills, close enough together to depend on each other, and close enough together to make privacy a theoretical concept. Clara had understood this when she'd arrived as Thomas's wife 7 years ago. She'd navigated it without much difficulty when Thomas was alive. Thomas had been a buffer of sorts. His presence had given her a clear and legible role, and legible roles were what a settlement like this ran on. Without him, she was a widow. Widows had roles too, but they were narrower and more demanding, and required a level of visible respectability that Clara, standing in Gideon Rourke's kitchen, was currently not providing. Martha Vane arrived on the 4th day. She came in a wagon driven by her oldest son, and she knocked on the front door with the particular knock of a woman who had decided what she was going to say before she arrived. Gideon's housekeeper, an older woman named Dottie, answered the door and showed her to the sitting room with the careful neutrality of someone who understood exactly what was happening and wanted no part of it. Gideon came in from the barn. Martha Vane was a woman in her late 50s with sharp features and the moral certainty of someone who had never seriously questioned any decision she'd made. She was not cruel. Exactly, Clara had thought about this later, and had to give her that much. She was the product of a particular belief system that genuinely held that the rules she enforced were there for everyone's protection, including the people she was enforcing them against. She was wrong about this, but she held the belief sincerely, and that sincerity made her more dangerous than deliberate cruelty would have been. "Gideon," she said, when he came in from the cold with barn smell on his coat, "I think you know why I'm here, I can guess. Then I won't waste time. Clara Whitmore cannot stay in this house. I'm sure your intentions are. I'm sure you meant to help. Appearances. Martha." His voice was quiet, not rude. "Just finished." "No." She blinked. She was not accustomed to being interrupted. "You don't understand what you're inviting. I understand exactly what I'd be inviting if I put a woman and her child back out in the snow, because it made this settlement uncomfortable," he said. "I'd be inviting a dead woman and a dead boy, and the knowledge that we let them die rather than endure some gossip." He looked at her steadily. "I won't do it." Martha Vane left without another word. Clara had heard it from the hallway upstairs. She hadn't meant to listen. Hun had come down for water and frozen at the top of the stairs when she heard her own name. She stood there until the front door closed, and then stood there a little longer, and then went back to the room without the water. Nobody had ever done that for her before. She didn't know what to do with it. She put it somewhere she couldn't quite reach yet, and left it there, and went back to figuring out how to be useful in a house that didn't need her, which was the only way she knew how to cope with any situation she couldn't control. She spent the first 3 days trying to be invisible. That was the strategy she landed on, not because it was a good one, but because it was the only one available to a woman in a borrowed house with no claim to anything in it. She kept Eli quiet, kept herself out of the main rooms during the hours when the ranch hands came in and out, and tried to take up as little space as possible in a household that hadn't asked for her. It didn't work, because nothing about Clara Whitmore was designed for invisibility. She was too observant, too restless, and too constitutionally incapable of watching something be done wrong without wanting to correct it. By the end of the second day, she had reorganized Dottie's kitchen storage system without being asked, noticed that the water barrel near the back door had a slow leak that nobody had patched, and quietly reinforced 3 of the fence slats on the chicken enclosure that were one good wind away from failing. Dottie, who was 61 years old and had been running Gideon Rourke's domestic arrangements since his wife died, watched all of this with the careful attention of a woman taking stock. She didn't say anything, not yet. Clara had also noticed the children. She'd known Gideon had 2, in the vague way you know things about people in a small settlement, their names, their ages, their general existence. Caleb was 10. Rose was 8. They were polite when they had to be and absent whenever they could manage it, which was most of the time. They ate their meals quickly and retreated upstairs with the practiced efficiency of children who had learned that the safest position in any household was one that attracted the least attention. She knew that pattern. She'd grown up with a version of it herself. On the 3rd evening, she found Rose sitting on the bottom step of the staircase in the dark. Not crying, just sitting there, knees pulled up, staring at the middle distance with the blank patience of a child who has been waiting for something for a long time and has stopped expecting it to arrive. Clara almost walked past, almost. "Can't sleep," she said. Rose looked up. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's from the portrait in the hallway fine-boned face. She looked at Clara the way children look at unfamiliar adults, not hostile, but measuring, gathering information before committing to any particular response. "I sleep fine," Rose said. It was clearly not true, but Clara didn't push it. She sat down on the step beside her instead, close enough to be present, but not so close that it felt like pressure. They sat in the dark together for a minute without talking. "Your boy's name is Eli," Rose said finally. "That's right. How old is he?" 6. Rose considered this. "He's young." "He is." Clara paused. "You're good with him, I noticed. This afternoon, when he was trying to get the barn door open, you showed him the trick with the handle." Something moved across the girl's face, not quite a smile, but in that direction. He was going to be at it all day. Probably. Clara looked at her hands in the dim light from the kitchen. "It was kind of you. He doesn't make friends easily. He's cautious with people he doesn't know." "Why?" Clara thought about how to answer that honestly, without putting more weight on a child's shoulders than she should. When bad things happen, sometimes kids get careful. They stop trusting that things will stay good. Rose was quiet for a moment. "Caleb's like that," she said. "Since Mama died." There it was. The thing underneath everything. The weight that this house had been carrying for 4 years in the particular wordless way that households carry grief around every corner. In every room that was a little too quiet. In every meal that was eaten without the person who used to make it. "That makes sense," Clara said. "It makes a lot of sense. Are you like that too?" The question was direct in the way that children's questions often are, no softening around the edges, no awareness of what it cost to answer. Clara felt it land somewhere between her ribs. "I was," she said. "I'm working on it." Rose thought about this with visible seriousness. Then she said goodnight, stood up, and went back up the stairs. Clara sat on the step alone. For a while after that, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about grief and carefulness, and the particular loneliness of a household that has learned to function without letting itself feel too much. She thought about Thomas. Not the fever, not the end, the ordinary things. The way he'd moved around their small cabin like he was always slightly too big for it. But the specific sound of his laugh when something genuinely caught him off guard. The fact that he'd been terrible at estimating how long tasks would take, relentlessly optimistic about mornings, unable to make coffee that didn't taste like dirt. Thought about these things deliberately, the way you press a bruise to remind yourself it's still there. And then she stood up and went to bed. She was getting better at the grief. She wasn't good at it yet, but she was getting better. The snow continued through the end of the week. Didn't pile deeper, the worst of the blizzard had passed, but it stayed cold enough that the trail down from the hills remained impassable, and the Whitmore cabin remained a structure nobody should be living in until the roof load was cleared and assessed. Gideon had sent Pell up to look at it. Once the weather cleared enough for a short ride, and Pell had come back with the information that 2 of the rafters were cracked, and the far corner of the roof had a sag that wasn't going to resolve itself. He told Gideon this at breakfast on a Thursday morning, while Clara was in the kitchen with Dottie. And he told him quietly, but the house was not large enough for that kind of news to stay contained. Clara appeared in the doorway of the dining room. "How bad?" she said. Pell looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Pell. Neither of them spoke immediately, which told Clara everything she needed to know. "How bad?" she said again. Not a question this time. "The corner needs to come down and be rebuilt," Pell said finally. He was a plain-spoken man and couldn't quite bring himself to soften it further than that. The 2 rafters either side of it need to be replaced. It's not a small job. "How long in winter?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "You're looking at, if the weather cooperates, 2, maybe 3 weeks. Minimum." Clara stood in the doorway. She did not look at Gideon. She looked at a spot on the dining room table and calculated something behind her eyes. Money, time. What favors she had available to call, what the repair would cost against what she had, and the calculation clearly did not come out anywhere good, because the look on her face went through about 4 different things in the space of 10 seconds before settling on something flat and controlled. "I'll pay for the materials," she said. Clara Gideon started. "I'll pay for the materials. I have some money." She paused. Sums. She went back into the kitchen. The sound of her resuming whatever she'd been doing with Dottie resumed almost immediately, and Gideon sat at his table and looked at Pell, and Pell put on the careful expression of a man who has spent 11 years not offering opinions on his employer's personal life. "Eat your breakfast," Gideon said, and that was the end of that conversation. What neither of them knew, what Clara had not told anyone, was that the $43 were gone. She'd worked through it in her head the night before, the store debt, the oil, the thread and salt she'd bought in October, the small emergency she'd had in September with Eli's boots. What she had left was closer to $12 and some coins. That $12 was sitting in the tin under the floorboards of a cabin with 2 cracked rafters and a sagging corner, and she hadn't touched it since November, and she wasn't entirely sure it was still there. Pride was still there. That much was certain. She found the cloth by accident. Dottie had sent her to pull extra blankets from the storage room off the upstairs hallway. Eli had developed a cough. Not serious but persistent. Dottie was of the generation that believed in burying a sick child under as many layers as possible and letting the body sweat out whatever was troubling it. Clara had pulled open the storage room door and was reaching for the shelf when she saw the trunk. It was pushed against the far wall, half hidden by a stack of folded curtains. It was a good trunk cedar, by the smell of it, with brass fittings that had gone green from neglect. Not the kind of thing you'd put in a storage room if it contained anything you used regularly. The kind of thing you'd put in a storage room if it contained something you couldn't look at. She didn't open it. She wasn't that person, the one who went through other people's things uninvited. She took the blankets and left and went back to Eli and tucked him in and sat beside him until his cough settled. She thought about the trunk. She thought about it again 2 days later when Rose came and stood in the doorway of the room where Clara was sitting and mending a task she'd claimed for herself, since Dottie's eyes were not what they'd been, and the pile of clothes needing attention had reached a point of genuine structural concern, and said, without preamble, "Mama used to sew." Clara looked up from the work. Did she? She had a lot of fabric. She was going to make new curtains for the big bedroom. Rose twisted the hem of her own dress between her fingers, unconsciously, the way children do when they're talking about something that costs them. She never got to. What happened to the fabric? Rose lifted one shoulder in a half shrug. Papa put it away. Clara set down the mending. What was your mama's name? Margaret. Rose said it quietly, with the careful pronunciation of someone who doesn't say a word often enough to say it casually. Margaret Ann. That's a pretty name. Rose sat down on the floor near the window, not quite close enough to be next to Clara, but not far enough to be separate. That was how she moved. Clara had noticed always in the middle distance, available but uncommitted, like she wasn't sure yet whether the warmth was safe to approach. Do you know how to make quilts? Rose said. I do. My mother taught me, and her mother taught her. Clara smoothed the fabric in her lap. It's not complicated, but it takes patience. Could you show me? Clara looked at her. You'd have to ask your father if I could use some of the scrap fabric. Probably say yes. Rose picked at a loose thread in the floorboard. He doesn't really say no to things. He just doesn't talk about them, which Clara had noticed. Gideon Rourke was present in his house the way a load-bearing wall is essential, structurally significant, and not particularly communicative. He ate his meals, gave his instructions to Pell and the hands, checked on his children in the brief, efficient way of a man who loves his children and hasn't the faintest idea how to show it in a way they can feel, and then worked until the light was gone or later. He did not talk about Margaret. He did not talk about much of anything that wasn't the ranch. Clara had started to understand that the cold in this house wasn't the winter kind. It had been here before November. She mentioned the fabric to Dottie, which was the equivalent of mentioning it to the household newsletter. Dottie mentioned it to Gideon. Gideon appeared in the doorway of the sitting room that evening, while Clara was still at her mending, stood there for a moment in the unannounced way he had, that wasn't quite rude and wasn't quite comfortable, and said, Dottie says you want to make quilts. Rose asked if I'd show her. A pause. There's scraps in the sewing basket. Help yourself. He started to leave. There's a trunk upstairs, Clara said. She hadn't planned to say it. She said it anyway. He stopped. The quality of the silence that followed was different from his ordinary silences. There was something in it, not anger, but something with weight to it. Something that pressed, I know. He said finally. I wasn't going to touch it. She picked her words with more care than she'd been using. There's fabric in it that's not being used. That could become something the children could use. She paused. That's all. That's all. He didn't answer right away. She could hear him breathing from across the room, slow and deliberate, the way a person breathes when they're working to keep something contained. I'll think about it, he said. He left. Clara went back to her mending and told herself she'd pushed too far and to leave it alone. Caleb spoke to her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon. He'd been the harder one to reach more close than Rose, older, with 4 years more of practice distance. He had the deliberate self-sufficiency of a child who had decided early that needing people was a vulnerability he couldn't afford, and he wore it so naturally you had to look twice to see it for what it was. He came into the kitchen when Clara was alone in it, went to the larder for something, turned around, and seemed surprised to find her still there, as if he'd expected her to have moved while his back was turned. Sorry, he said, reflex. You live here, she said. You don't have to apologize for being in your own kitchen. He stood near the larder door with a piece of cornbread in his hand and didn't seem to know what to do with the information. Eli was asking about you, Clara said after a moment. She wasn't sure if it was true, but it was probably true. Eli had been watching Caleb with the focused attention he reserved for people he wanted to impress and hadn't yet figured out how to approach. He's little, Caleb said. He is. He talks a lot. He does. Clara turned back to what she was doing. He's been quieter since his father died, but he's coming back. Caleb was silent. She heard him shift his weight, and she didn't look up, because she'd learned that looking at him directly seemed to put him on guard, the way looking directly at a skittish animal sends it backward. How long does it take, he said. Coming back. The question was careful, too casual, too offhand, precisely the kind of question someone asks when they need the answer badly and can't afford to sound like they need it. She thought about lying, about giving him the clean version, the reassuring, finite, manageable version. She thought about it and decided against it because he was 10 years old, and he'd been lied to by omission long enough. I don't know, she said, honestly. It's different for everybody. For me, it's been almost a year and I'm still partway. Most days, she paused. But most days is better than it was. She heard him chew the cornbread, heard him think. Does it help, he said? Doing things, keeping busy. Sometimes. Sometimes it's just a way to avoid feeling it, which doesn't actually help. It's hard to know which one you're doing when you're in the middle of it. Another silence. Papa works all the time, Caleb said. I know. He started doing that after Mama died. I know, she said again, more quietly. Caleb finished the cornbread. She heard him put the cloth napkin on the counter, heard him start toward the door. She used to make this, he said, without turning around. Cornbread, hers was better. It probably was, Clara said. He left. She stood at the counter and breathed for a moment, feeling the particular specific tenderness of a conversation that cost someone something to have. Then she went back to work, because that was what you did, and she was still in the middle of figuring out which kind it was. Gideon came to her 3 days after their conversation about the trunk. She was in the sitting room. Again, it had become her room, by default, the one she occupied during the hours, when she needed to be somewhere and didn't want to be in the way. She'd pulled the sewing basket close and was working through the scraps, sorting by weight and color in the methodical way her mother had shown her, a task that required just enough attention to quiet her mind without consuming it. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. He was holding a key. It was a small key, iron, worn smooth from being held. He looked at it in his own hand for a moment, as if still deciding something. And then he crossed the room and set it on the corner of the side table nearest to her. The trunk, he said. Margaret's sewing things are in there. Fabric. Dresses, He stopped, started again. She had projects she hadn't finished. I don't know what's still usable. Clara looked at the key. She did not reach for it. Are you sure? She said. He was quiet for long enough that the answer might have been no. Then he said, Rose hasn't slept through the night in 4 years. If there's something in that trunk that's going to be used instead of just sitting there. He stopped again. He was not a man who spoke in long sentences when the subject cost him. Yes, I'm sure. He left without waiting for her to say anything else, and Clara sat with the key on the table beside her for a while, before she picked it up. The trunk smelled of cedar and lavender and thyme. She opened it in the storage room with the door closed, which felt right private, as if what was inside deserved to be looked at with some care before it was taken out into the light. Margaret Rourke had been an organized woman. The fabric was folded cleanly, sorted by type, with paper pinned to each piece in small, careful handwriting noting what it was for. 2 yards of blue wool, curtains for the east bedroom, a length of yellow cotton, Rose's spring dress, a pattern, carefully cut from stiff paper for a child's quilt. Clara sat on the floor of the storage room and went through it slowly. There were 4 dresses at the bottom, folded with the same care as the fabric not hastily put away, but placed deliberately as if Gideon had taken time even in his grief to do it properly. Dark green wool she'd clearly worn in winter, a blue calico, a gray dress with small buttons that looked like the kind of thing you'd wear to something official, something that mattered, and a brown cotton work dress, soft from washing, with a small tear at the left cuff that had never been mended. That tear undid Clara in a way she hadn't expected. It was such a specific, ordinary thing, the torn cuff, the unmended small damage of daily life, still there because there hadn't been time to fix it before the time ran out. She sat with the dresses for a long time. She wasn't crying, exactly. It was something adjacent to it, something quieter. She was thinking about Margaret, whom she'd never known well, and about the curtains that never got made, and about a woman who had folded her own dresses carefully and then died before she could take them out again. She thought about what it meant to take them apart. She thought about what it meant not to. She started with the scraps from the sewing basket. That was the right way to begin, not with the dresses. Not yet. She needed to prove the idea first, to herself and to the household, before she asked it to carry more weight than a simple quilt. Rose was her shadow from the first morning. She pulled her stool close and watched with a focused intensity that reminded Clara sharply of Eli. The way both children watched things they wanted to understand without yet knowing how to ask. She showed Rose how to cut the squares, even how to keep the scissors flat against the fabric, and move in a single smooth motion instead of sawing. She showed her how to hold the needle, how to push it through with the flat of the thimble rather than the fingertip, how to make a knot that wouldn't pull through. Rose's first 3 stitches were enormous and uneven. Exactly how mine looked, Clara said. Rose looked at her sideways. Really? Worse. Probably. My mother told me the first quilt she made. The squares were so uneven. The squares were It had been put together by someone having a disagreement with themselves. Rose laughed. It was a small sound, surprised out of her, and it seemed to surprise her too, as if she hadn't done it in a while and had forgotten the mechanics of it. Eli wandered in halfway through the morning and sat on the floor near Rose's stool and started asking questions about the needle, about the thread, about why you had to cut the squares the same size, about what would happen if you didn't. Rose answered him with the patience of someone who has unexpectedly found themselves the authority on a subject. Clara listened and kept sewing and thought that this was what warmth looked like, from the inside, not dramatic, not transformative in any visible way, just a child asking questions and another child answering them, while something useful got made. Caleb pretended not to watch from the hallway. He'd been doing this for 3 days, appearing near doorways at the relevant times, and then having somewhere else to be when anyone looked up. Clara had started acknowledging him, without making it a thing, the same way you acknowledge a cat that's decided to be near you without technically being near you. A nod, a normal comment, nothing that required him to commit to being present. On the 4th afternoon, he came in and sat down. He didn't ask for anything to do. He didn't explain himself. He sat down in the corner chair and watched, and Clara handed him a piece of fabric without comment and said, "You can tear that into strips if you want. Along the grain feel which way it wants to come apart and go with it." He did it wrong at first, and then right, and then he sat there tearing strips for an hour without speaking, and Clara let the silence be the thing it was, which was a boy who was trying to find his way back to something he'd lost, using the only route currently available to him. Gideon found her in the sitting room on a Thursday evening when everyone else had gone to bed. She'd stayed up late. She often did. She slept better if she'd exhausted herself first, and she was piecing together the first real section of the quilt top, scraps laid out across the floor in a pattern she'd been working through in her head for days. The lamp was low. The fire had burned down to a solid mass of red coals. He came in the way he often moved through his own house, quietly, as if trying not to disturb the air. Stopped inside the door and looked at the fabric spread across the floor. "You're up late," he said. "So are you." He came and stood near the fire, not close enough to crowd her workspace. He looked at the pattern she'd laid out, the way she'd arranged the colors, the logic of it. She watched him try to see what it was going to be. "It's going to be a double wedding ring pattern," she said. I'm still working out the color sequence. I don't know what that is. Circles. Interlocking. When it's done, it looks like rings linked together." She paused. "Complicated to piece, but it lies flat well." Crouched down at the edge of the fabric to look more closely, and for a moment she saw him the way she suspected. He rarely let himself be seen, not the rancher, not the man in charge. Just a person looking at something with genuine interest that he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected to feel. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Quilting. Since I was 7, my mother. And hers before her. Thomas never mentioned it. Thomas thought of it as a household chore, which it is. It's also other things." She picked up a square of red calico and turned it in the lamplight. "When my mother was sick, the last year, she couldn't do much of anything else. She could quilt. She said it was the one thing that still belonged entirely to her." He was quiet, studying the pattern. "I was thinking," Clara said carefully, "about the dresses in the trunk." He didn't move, but something in the stillness shifted. "I've been thinking about what I could make from them, if you'd allow it." She kept her voice even, factual, not putting too much weight behind it. "Not all of them. but the cotton one's the brown and the blue calico. There's enough fabric in both of them for a child's quilt. 2, maybe if I'm careful with the cutting. He didn't answer immediately. Push it. 1 for each of them, she said, from the fabric of their mother's dresses, so they'd have something made from something that was hers. Fire shifted, settled. A log rolled slightly against the grate. Gideon stood up. He stood there with his back half turned to her, looking at the coals, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the effort in them, the particular tension of someone working to hold something back that doesn't want to be held. You don't have to decide now, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Yes, he said. It came out rough, like it had cost him something to say it, which it had. She understood that. She didn't thank him, because she'd learned that thanking him for things made him retreat, as if gratitude were a pressure he didn't know how to absorb. I'll be careful with them, she said instead. I'll save everything I can't use. He nodded. He left. Clara sat in the lamplight with the red calico square in her hand for a long time, thinking about what the word yes could hold when a person had to fight their way to it. By the end of February, the quilt tops were taking shape. She'd been working steadily. In the early mornings before, the household was fully awake, and in the evenings after the children were in bed, and the piecing had gone faster than she'd expected, because Rose had turned out to have a natural instinct for it, the eye for pattern, the patience with repetitive work that made her genuinely useful rather than just present. Together they'd gotten through the scraps from the basket and started on the cotton dresses. That part she'd done alone. It wasn't that she didn't trust Rose with it. It was that she wanted to think about Margaret Rourke while she cut, without the pressure of conversation. She wanted to acknowledge, in whatever private, wordless way seemed fitting, that she was taking something apart in order to make it into something else, and that required a kind of attention she couldn't divide. The brown work dress she cut slowly. She felt the softness of the fabric, worn to almost nothing in places from years of regular use, and thought about what hands had been in those sleeves, what days had been lived in that cloth. She saved the small section with the torn cuff and set it aside, separate. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it, but she couldn't cut it. The blue calico came apart more easily, or maybe she'd worked herself into a different state, by then steadier, clearer. Pattern Margaret had chosen, for it was small blue flowers on white, and it would anchor the lighter half of Rose's quilt beautifully once it was pieced in. She could see it already, the way quilters see, not as fabric, but as the finished thing, the whole that the parts were going to become. She was finishing the last seam on the center medallion of Caleb's quilt top on a Thursday evening, when she heard someone on the stairs. Not Dottie. Dottie's step was distinctive, deliberate, with a slight drag on the left side from an old ankle injury. Not the children they'd gone up an hour ago. She heard the pause at the bottom of the stairs, the particular silence of someone who has stopped because they see a light and haven't decided yet what to do about it. Gideon came into the room. He looked at the quilt top spread across her lap. She could see him registering the fabric, recognizing it. She watched his face do the thing it always did when something came at him sideways, which was go very still while the interior working was invisible. She held it up slightly so he could see the full center medallion. Brown and blue, the two dresses woven together in the pattern, surrounded by a ring of scraps in amber and green, and a deep red that she'd found in the bottom of the basket. Good work, she knew. It was good. Not with pride, but with the plain assessment of someone who had been doing something long enough to know when they'd done it right. He looked at it for a long time. That's hers, he said finally. Not a question, yes. The brown and the blue calico. The rest is from the scrap basket. He reached out and touched the edge of the medallion with 2 fingers, lightly. She watched him feel the fabric feel it, the way you feel a thing when you're trying to determine whether it's real or whether you've misunderstood something. It doesn't look like I thought it would look like I'd taken something apart, he said. It just looks like something new, she said. That's the idea. He took his hand back, stood there. Rose is going to sleep under something made from her mother's dresses, Clara said, and so is Caleb. And when they're old and they pass them on, whoever has them will be under something that still has Margaret in it, in the cloth. The sound he made was not quite anything she had a word for. It was low and brief, and it came from somewhere. He didn't usually let things come from. And then he turned partly away and pressed his forearm against the mantel and stood there for a moment with his head down. She did not say anything. She went back to her seam. After a while, he pushed off the mantel and straightened up and said, "Good night, Clara," and left the room, and she heard his boots on the stairs, slow and even, and then the sound of a door closing on the floor above. She stayed up until the seam was finished. It was late when she finally gathered the quilt top and folded it over the chair back and blew out the lamp and stood in the dark of the sitting room for a moment before going up. The house was quiet around her, not the dead quiet of the frozen cabin that had nearly killed her, but the occupied quiet of a house full of people who were, all of them, imperfectly, trying to get through. She thought she could hear, above her, through the ceiling, the particular sound of a man who was not used to crying, learning again how it was done. She went to bed. The quilts were finished on a Saturday morning, in early March. Clara had been up before the household, the way she often was now. It had become her time. That hour before, Dottie started the stove, and the children came down, and the ranch hands began arriving at the back door. She used it to work without being watched, which was different from working alone. Being watched changed the work slightly. It made her conscious of her hands, of the pace she was setting, of whether what she was doing was being read correctly. In those early morning hours, she could just sew, the way her mother had taught her, without performance, without explanation, with the needle going in and out of the fabric, and the pattern growing beneath her hands, the way a field comes into itself, in spring, not all at once but steadily, on its own schedule. She'd put the binding on Caleb's quilt the night before. Roses she finished in the early morning gray light, the last few inches of binding folded and stitched with the small tight stitches that her mother had always said were the signature of a quilter who actually meant it. When the last knot was tied, she sat with both quilts folded in her lap for a moment, one in each arm, the way you'd hold two children who were finally asleep, and let herself feel what she'd made. They were good. She knew they were good. Not perfect Rose's center medallion. Had a seam that pulled slightly on the left side, a consequence of a Tuesday afternoon when Eli had needed her attention halfway through a critical step and she'd come back to it distracted but good, solid, made with intention. The fabric of Margaret's dresses moved through both of them the way water moves through a landscape, present everywhere, shaping the whole without announcing itself, carried them upstairs. She put Caleb's on the end of his bed while he was still sleeping, folded at the foot, the way you fold something you want someone to find rather than be told about. Rose's she laid across the chair by Rose's window, where the morning light would catch the blue calico first thing when Rose opened her eyes. Then she went back downstairs and started the coffee and waited. She heard Rose first. Not words a sound, the particular sound of a child encountering something unexpected that reaches them in the chest before the mind catches up. Then footsteps, rapid, on the floor above. Then Rose's voice calling Caleb's name with the urgency of someone who cannot contain a thing alone and needs another person to make it real. She heard them in the hallway. She heard the low sound of Caleb's voice, and then Rose's again, faster. She heard them on the stairs. They both stopped in the kitchen doorway. Rose was holding her quilt in her arms, clutching it the way you clutch something you're afraid to put down. Her face was the complicated, specific face of a child who is trying very hard not to cry and losing the attempt. Caleb had his over one shoulder, folded badly, the way a boy carries a thing when he grabbed it quickly and didn't stop to think. He was looking at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between accusation and wonder, as if she'd done something to him that he hadn't consented to and wasn't sure he should forgive her for. "You used Mama's dresses," Rose said. Her voice was unsteady. "Yes, the blue one and the brown one. Yes." Rose looked down at the fabric in her arms. pressed her face against it briefly, just a second, just long enough to breathe it in, and then pulled back and looked up at Clara with her eyes full. "Does it still smell like her?" Clara asked gently. Rose shook her head, "No." "But she stopped. Tried again. "It feels the same." Caleb hadn't moved from the doorway. Clara looked at him. He was staring at the quilt on his own shoulder, at the brown fabric of the work dress, running through the pattern, and his face was doing something it hadn't done in front of her before, or anyone, she suspected, in a long time. It was coming apart slowly, the way ice comes apart in the first real thaw, not all at once, with no single dramatic moment, just the gradual yielding of something that had been held rigid for too long. "Caleb," she said quietly. He looked up at her. "You don't have to say anything," she said. He nodded. And then, without warning, without the dignified stoicism she suspected he'd been holding as a point of personal pride since the age of 6, he started to cry. Not the polite, contained crying of a boy trying to maintain some version of control, the real kind, the kind that comes up from the gut, unmanageable, that takes over the face and the shoulders and makes the whole body seem smaller than it is. Clara was across the kitchen before she decided to move, put her arms around him, and he let her, which told her more about how much he'd needed it than anything he could have said. He was 10 years old, and he had been carrying 4 years of grief with the determined competence of someone twice his age, and the quilt had gotten underneath all of it in a way that nothing else had. Rose came and pressed against Clara's other side without being asked. They stood like that in the kitchen for a while, the three of them, in the pale morning light, with the coffee going untended on the stove, and Clara held both of them and felt, beneath her grief for Thomas and her uncertainty about everything else, something that she hadn't felt in so long. She'd almost forgotten the shape of it, the specific gravity of being needed. She heard the back door. Gideon came in from the early morning barn, check the way he always did. Cold air and hay smell, boots knocked against the step, coat shrugged off on the hook by the door, turned into the kitchen and stopped. He stood in the doorway and took in the scene, his 2 children, both crying, pressed against a woman who was not their mother and was holding them like she was. 2 quilts, the brown and blue fabric of Margaret's dresses visible in both. Coffee getting too strong on the stove. Clara looked at him over the top of Rose's head. He looked back at her. Something crossed his face that she had no precise name for, too layered, too many things at once. His jaw tightened. His hands at his sides closed briefly, and then opened. He walked across the kitchen. He put his hand on the back of Caleb's head, the large, careful hand of a man who is better at this than he knows, and held it there. Caleb turned and pressed into his father's chest, and Gideon's arms went around both his children, and Clara stepped back to give them the space that was theirs. She went to the stove and pulled the coffee before it burned. She stood with her back to them, giving them the privacy of the moment, and looked out the kitchen window at the pale March sky, and the snow that was still on the ground, but already retreating, pulling back from the fence posts, pulling back from the edges of the yard, showing the dark earth beneath. Spring was coming. She'd known it was coming. She'd been tracking it the way you track things that matter. The length of the days, the quality of the light, the specific smell of the air in the morning, when the temperature had climbed 2 or 3 degrees overnight, without announcing itself. Spring meant the trail would open. Spring meant the cabin could be repaired. Spring meant, in the logic she'd been living by since November, that she would have no more reason to be here. She poured the coffee and set the cups on the table and sat down. Whatever came next, this morning was real. She held on to that. Problem with Ezekiel Crowe was that he had never once in his adult life been in a position where he needed something from someone who didn't want to give it to him. Clara had worked this out over the weeks she'd been in Red Hollow, piecing it together from what people said, and more usefully, from what they didn't say. He was the settlement's largest landowner after Gideon, which meant he was used to having his concerns taken seriously. He sat on the council that managed the few civic functions Red Hollow had managed to establish the school, the water allocation, the road maintenance fund, which meant he had learned early that authority, when applied consistently and with enough confidence, didn't need to justify itself. He was not stupid. That was important to understand. Stupid man would have been easier to handle. Ezekiel Crow was intelligent in the specific way of someone who had studied human social dynamics carefully and understood exactly which levers to pull and in which order. He had used this intelligence over many years to make himself effectively untouchable in Red Hollow, not through fear exactly, but through the more insidious mechanism of making people feel that his goodwill was essential to their standing. Martha Vane was his instrument, whether she knew it or not. Clara had seen that clearly from the morning Martha arrived at the door. Martha believed sincerely in what she was doing. Ezekiel had simply understood how to make Martha's sincere beliefs useful to him. What Ezekiel actually wanted was more complicated than moral outrage, and it took Clara until mid-March to understand it fully. She understood it because of Pell. Pell was not a man who gossiped. He was careful with information, precise, gave you what was necessary, and kept the rest. But he was also fair constitutionally so, in the way of some men who have seen enough of the world's unfairness to find it genuinely offensive. And on a Wednesday afternoon when he found Clara in the barn, assessing the structural damage to an old storage ladder that she thought she might be able to repair, he stood near the barn door for a moment and then said, without preamble, "You know, Crow's been after the Whitmore land." Clara set down the ladder rung she'd been examining. "No," she said. "I didn't know that." Pell was quiet for a moment, as if working through whether he'd said the right thing. Then he said, "Thomas borrowed money from him. 3 years ago, before he had a bad season. Lost a third of the cattle. He borrowed from Crow to cover the seed for spring. Thomas never told me about that." I don't suppose he would have. Pell had the tact not to elaborate on why. The loan had terms. Crow's loans always have terms. If the land can't service the debt within a certain period, he has the right of first purchase at the assessed value. He paused. Assessed value, he has a considerable hand in setting. Clara stood in the barn and thought about the $43 in the tin under the floorboards. She thought about the $12 that were left after the debts. She thought about the loan she hadn't known existed. "How much?" she said. Pell told her. She was quiet for a moment. "That's more than the land is worth." "The interest," he said. "Compounds." She turned the ladder rung over in her hands. It was cracked along the grain repairable. If you knew what you were doing, not worth the effort if you didn't. She thought about Ezekiel Crow arriving at the public meeting to point his finger at a widow. She thought about the timing of it. February, when the snow was deep and the settlement was restless, and Clara's presence in Gideon's house had been going on long enough to have ripened into something people could use. "He wants me gone," she said, "because if I'm gone, there's no one managing the land, and the debt clock keeps running." "If you're gone," Pell said carefully, "and there's no one on the land, and the trail stays buried for another month, there's a legal argument to be made about abandonment." Clara looked at him. "You know a lot about land law." "I had occasion to learn some." He didn't elaborate. "Thought you should know." He went back to work. She stood in the barn for a long time after he left. Told Gideon that evening. She almost didn't. She went back and forth on it for the hours between the barn and dinner and the children going to bed, weighing the cost of telling him against the cost of handling it alone, which was the same argument she always had with herself and always resolved wrong. But this was different from the cabin. This was not her pride about her own survival. This was about the land, and the land had Eli's future in it, and she was not going to sacrifice her son's inheritance to the same impulse that had almost killed them both in November. She knocked on the door of his office. He was doing accounts, she could tell from the look he had when he looked up, the specific distraction of numbers that don't balance. He set down his pen. She told him what Pell had told her. She told it plainly, without the emotional weight she was actually feeling, because she'd found that was the only way to have a useful conversation with Gideon. Rourke, strip it to the facts first. Let him process. Wait. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she could see him working through it, the legal architecture of it, the timeline, the exposure. "How long has the loan been running?" he said. Pell said 3 years. Thomas took it out in March, 3 years ago. I remember that season. He rubbed the side of his jaw. I offered to lend Thomas the money myself. He didn't want it. Clara looked at him. He didn't tell me that either. Gideon's expression shifted slightly, not quite apology, but an acknowledgement that this was a lot of information to receive about a man she'd been married to. He stopped. He had pride about certain things. I know, a silence. "The debt is real," Gideon said. "If the terms are what Pell says they are, and Crow's been letting the interest run," he was quiet, calculating. "You need a lawyer. Not the one in this settlement. There's no money for a lawyer. There will be." She looked at him sharply. He held up a hand before she could speak. "Not a gift," he said. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you, let's call it an advance against the quilt orders I'm going to bring in for you." Stared at him. "What quilt orders?" "I've been writing to people." He said it, the way he said things he expected to be argued with, flat, factual, without elaboration. The Hargrove family in Millhaven, the Denisons, the Castillo Ranch. "I mentioned your work to people who would know others, who'd want it. You've been without asking me. I was going to ask you," he said. "I'm asking you now. Is that acceptable?" She sat in the chair across from his desk, which she hadn't been invited to sit in, and sat in anyway because her legs needed it. She looked at this man, at his careful, closed face, the deliberate practicality he used to rap, every generous impulse, so that the generosity was nearly invisible, and felt something shift in the complicated architecture of how she thought about him. "You've been doing this since when?" she said. "Since the first week. She stopped, started again. "You thought my quilts were good enough to sell. From the first week." "From the first week." He looked at her steadily. "I grew up watching women quilt. I know the difference between a person who can do it and a person who's good at it." Clara looked at her own hands. She thought about her mother and her grandmother and the particular tradition of skill passing from woman to woman across generations, carrying something forward that didn't have a name, but was real and had weight. She thought about the fact that Gideon Rourke had seen it from across a sitting room before she'd said a word to him about it. "All right," she said. "I'll take the advance. Against orders, with interest." "Don't need to add interest." "I know I don't need to. I'm adding it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression did the complicated, half-visible shifting thing it did when she'd done something that caught him off guard. Then he said, "All right, and I'm writing to the lawyer myself," she said. "You can give me the name, but I'm handling the correspondence." "I expected that." She stood up. She was at the door before he said her name, and she turned. "Crow's going to move faster now," Gideon said. "Once he figures out, he'll want to force the issue before you have time to get legal standing. I know. He'll bring it to the public meeting. He'll use Martha Vane. He'll use whatever he has." He looked at her steadily. "He's been the biggest voice in this settlement for 15 years. People are used to following his lead." "I know," she said again. "You're not scared." It was a statement, not a question, but she answered it honestly. "I'm scared. I'm just more angry than I am scared. Those aren't the same thing." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about Ezekiel Crow and about the particular unfairness of a man who could point at a woman in public and call her a scandal while quietly engineering the theft of her land. Thought about Thomas, who had borrowed money in secret and died in secret with the debt still running. She thought about Eli, asleep down the hall, who deserved the 40 acres and the cabin and whatever future could be built from them. She was not going to let Ezekiel Crow take it. She was not entirely sure how she was going to stop him yet, but she had the clarity that comes from having nothing left, to be afraid of losing the specific kind of courage that isn't really courage at all, but just the absence of any remaining option. The letter to the lawyer in Hartfield went out on a Friday with the supply wagon. Clara wrote it herself, at Gideon's desk while he was out with the cattle. using his pen and his ink and his paper, and feeling no guilt about any of it. She laid out the situation plainly: the loan, the terms as Pell had described them, the debt amount, the compounding interest, the question of whether the terms were legally enforceable in the territory under the current statutes. She asked for an initial assessment and a cost estimate for representation. She signed it with her name and the ranch address, which was the only functioning address she had. She sealed it and put it with the outgoing mail, and then sat at the desk for a moment, listening to the house. Dottie was in the kitchen. Rose was somewhere upstairs. She could hear the faint, industrious sound of someone working with fabric, the small rhythmic noise of a needle going through cloth. Eli was outside with Caleb, doing whatever they'd been doing for the past hour that involved the old feed bucket and a considerable amount of shouting. She thought about the legal letter, and then she thought about Ezekiel Crow, and then she thought about the public meeting that Gideon had warned her was coming, and she understood, with the clarity she was developing about this particular situation, the legal route and the public meeting were two separate battles, and she was going to need to be ready to fight both at once. One she could plan for, one she couldn't. She went to find Rose. Rose had set herself up in the upstairs hallway with the good afternoon light, her sewing supply, and the small pile of scraps Clara had given her permission to work with on her own. She'd been attempting a 9-patch block for the past 3 days, and the current version was, objectively, not a success. The squares were uneven enough that the finished block had a slight but definite lean to it, as if the whole thing were bracing against a wind that nobody else could feel. Clara sat down across from her on the floor. "How's it going?" Rose held up the block, with the expression of someone presenting evidence of a crime they committed against themselves. "It leans," Clara said. "I know it leans. The center square is cut about a 1/4 inch too big on the right side. That's where the lean starts." Rose looked at it. "Can I fix it?" "You can take out the seam on that side and recut the square. It'll lose a little of the pattern at the edge, but you'll get the lean out." Rose studied it for another moment, then put it down and started picking out the seam with the small tool Clara had shown her for exactly this purpose. She was careful, focused. Clara had noticed this about her. When she was working with her hands, the particular fidgety restlessness she carried in her body, most of the time the hair twisting, the hem picking, the constant small motion settled. The work absorbed it. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Yes." "What do people in town say about me?" "The people your age." Rose looked up from the seam picking. "They say your husband died and left you poor, and you moved into Pops's house. What else?" Rose's eyes went back to the work. "Some of them say their mothers say that it's not right. You're that Papa and you." She stopped. "It's not true. I know it's not true. But I want to understand what people think." "Why?" "Because there's going to be a meeting. And the man who's been saying the worst things about me is going to say them loudly in front of everyone. And I need to understand what's underneath it." Rose was quiet for a moment. She finished picking out the seam and held up the pieces. "Mr. Crow talks about it the most," she said. "My friend Alice, her father works for Mr. Crow," she said. "Her father said that Mr. Crow is going to make you leave. Why does Mr. Crow care so much?" Rose looked at her with the specific directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften obvious things. "Because he wants Papa to sell him the grazing rights to the north pasture. He's been asking for 2 years, and Papa won't, because he says those rights are worth more than Crow is offering. And now you're here, and Papa's—" She stopped. "Papa's what?" Clara said carefully. Rose looked back at her seam. "Different," she said. "Since you came, he talks more. At dinner, he asks us things." She picked up her needle. "Mr. Crow used to come to dinner sometimes. He hasn't been asked since you came. I think he's jealous." Clara sat with that for a moment. "Jealous of what, do you think?" "That Papa doesn't need him anymore." Rose pulled the thread through the new seam. "Mr. Crow always acts like everyone needs him, like you have to stay on his good side. Pa used to—" She considered her words carefully, the way she did when she was being precise. "Papa used to go along with things he didn't like, because it was easier. He does it less now." Clara looked at this child, at the 8-year-old, who had been watching the adult social dynamics of this settlement with the careful attention of someone who had learned early that the information mattered and thought about what it meant to grow. Reading rooms, because rooms were the only thing you could read. Thank you, she said. That's useful. Are you going to beat him? Rose said. Matter of fact, like asking about the weather. I'm going to try. Rose nodded and went back to her sewing. Good, she said. He's not nice. The first quilt order arrived 2 weeks later. Came in a letter from a woman in Millhaven named Eleanor Hargrove, who wrote in the careful, formal hand of someone who had been taught that letters were important documents and treated them accordingly. She'd heard from a mutual contact from Gideon's letter to her husband, though she didn't say so directly, that there was a quilter in Red Hollow doing exceptional work, and she was interested in commissioning a full-size double wedding ring quilt for her daughter at the upcoming marriage. She specified the color range she had in mind, asked for a price, and enclosed a preliminary deposit of $8 as a demonstration of good faith. Clara read the letter 3 times. $8 for a preliminary deposit. The full quilt, based on what she knew of the fabric cost, the time would run to $30 or $35 at minimum. More if the customer wanted specific fabrics sourced, rather than working from what Clara had available. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the $8 and did the arithmetic in her head. 2 quilts a month, maybe 3 if she could source good fabric efficiently. The debt to Crow, the cabin repair. Eli's boots, which he was going to outgrow by summer, the lawyer's fee. The interest on Gideon's advance. It was possible. Not comfortable, not easy. Not without work, but possible. She could see the shape of it. Dottie came in from the garden and looked at Clara's face and put the kettle on without being asked. Good news? She said. The first order. Clara set the letter down. For a wedding quilt. Dottie put cups on the table and sat down across from her with the comfortable authority of a woman who has been in a household long enough to have earned her place at every table in it. She looked at Clara steadily. There'll be more, she said. Once the first one goes out and people see it. I hope so. Don't hope. Plan. Dottie poured the tea. Hope is for people who don't have anything to do with their hands. You have things to do with your hands. Clara looked at her. Dottie was looking back with the specific expression she wore when she'd said what she thought and had nothing to add. A good expression. Clara had come to trust it. Can I ask you something? Clara said. You're going to either way. What did this house feel like before? Before Margaret died. Dottie was quiet for a moment, holding her cup. Full, she said. Loud, she stopped, chose her words. She was the kind of person who made a room aware of itself. You knew when she was in it, and you knew when she wasn't. Did she and Gideon Clara start it? They fought, Dottie said simply. Real fights, not performances. They disagreed about things that mattered and said so. That's how you could tell they respected each other. She looked at her cup. After she died, he went quiet, like a clock someone forgot to wind. The children went quiet too, because children follow the emotional weather of the house. But they didn't leave, Clara said. They stayed quiet. That's different from falling apart. Gideon Rourke doesn't fall apart, Dottie said. Calcifies. He keeps moving and keeps working and keeps the outside functioning and lets the inside go as cold as it needs to go. It's very efficient, and it's very bad for him. Clara drank her tea. You changed something, Dottie said. The quilts, not the quilts. Dottie looked at her directly. You came into this house, and you were too busy trying not to need anything to perform, being fine, and that was something he recognized. And the children recognized it too. She paused. People who are genuinely struggling are easier to be around than people who are pretending not to be. Everyone here had been pretending for 4 years. Clara sat with that. He's going to ask you to stay, Dottie said, quietly, simply, as if it were an item on a list. He hasn't. He's going to. Dottie stood up and took her cup to the sink. I'm telling you so. You have time to figure out what you actually want before he does. Because you're going to be a successful businesswoman by midsummer, and you're going to have your cabin repaired, and you're going to have no practical reason left to be here, and you're going to have to decide what you want on your own terms. Not out of necessity, she turned. I suspect that's new for you. Clara looked at the letter from Eleanor Hargrove, still on the table. It is, she said. The public meeting was called for the last Thursday of March. Ezekiel Crowe had requested it through the Settlement Council, citing matters of community conduct and the moral standing of Red Hollow. It was the kind of language that meant everything and nothing, the kind that gave the person using it maximum flexibility and gave everyone else maximum anxiety. Gideon told Clara about it on a Monday evening. She already knew Rose had told her because Alice's father had told Alice, because information moved through Red Hollow the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack and seeping through. You don't have to go, Gideon said. They were in the sitting room. It had become, over the weeks, the room where they talked not by decision but by accumulation, by the habit of two people who found each other there, often enough that it became the designated space for the conversations that mattered. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm going. He looked at her. Could see him calculating something, not whether she should go, but something else. Something more personal. He's going to say things, Gideon said, in front of everyone. He's very good at it. He knows how to phrase things so they're not quite accusations, but they land the same way. I know what he's going to say. Clara. Gideon. She said his name the way she rarely did directly, with the full weight of attention behind it, the way you say a word when you need a person to hear it. I've been afraid of the wrong things my whole life. I was afraid of asking for help when I was dying in that cabin. I was afraid of letting anyone see that I needed rescuing. I was afraid of what it would look like to stay here. So I spent the first 3 weeks trying to take up no space at all. She paused. I'm not afraid of Ezekiel Crowe. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. But I need you to let me handle it, she said. Or most of it. I need to be the one who stands up. Something moved across his face. You think I'm going to... I think you're going to want to defend me. I think that impulse is good, and I'm not asking you to not have it. I'm asking you to let me go first. She held his eyes. If I stand up in that room and let you speak for me, I'm exactly what Crowe is saying. I am a woman who needs a man to fight her battles. If I stand up myself, I'm something else. Gideon was quiet. He has the land debt, she said. He has Martha Vane. He has 15 years of social capital in this settlement. She paused. What I have is the truth about what happened, and I think that's enough. But I have to be the one to say it. He sat with it. She watched him sit with it, the resistance to it, and then the reluctant recognition that she was right. You'll let me speak after? He said yes. After. He nodded. She went to bed that night and did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about what she was going to say, turning the words over in her mind, the way she turned fabric in her hands before cutting, looking for the grain, the direction that would hold, the line along which it would come apart cleanly if it needed to. She thought about the cabin and the cold and the 3 days she'd lain under the blankets telling herself stories that weren't true. She thought about Eli's hand in hers at the back of the meeting room, and the way his weight against her leg had been the most real thing she'd felt in months. She thought about the chimney. A chimney without smoke on the 3rd morning of a blizzard. That was where it had started, not with pride or shame or the opinions of Ezekiel Crowe. With a man who noticed something that everyone else had missed and got on his horse and rode into the cold without anyone asking him to. She was going to stand up in that room and tell the truth about all of it, not the version that made her look strong, not the version that made Gideon look like a hero, but the actual truth with all the failure and the pride and the fear in it, kind of truth that was hard to dismiss because it was too specific to be invented. Closed her eyes. Outside, the March wind moved through the settlement, and somewhere beneath the snow, the first tentative roots of the coming season were already pushing downward into the thawing ground. The Thursday of the public meeting arrived the way bad weather arrives, announced well in advance, which somehow makes it worse. You have time to think about it. Time to imagine every possible version of how it goes, most of them wrong, all of them exhausting. Clara was up before 4. She didn't try to go back to sleep. She lay in the dark for 20 minutes after waking, running through what she intended to say, the way you run through a thing you've memorized, not to practice it, but to make sure it was still there, that the words hadn't shifted overnight into something she didn't recognize. They were still there. She got up. She dressed carefully. Not in her best, she didn't have a best anymore. Not really. The good dress she'd worn to Thomas's funeral had been turned into quilt, backing months ago out of financial necessity, but in the cleanest of what she had, dark blue wool that Dottie had pressed for her the night before, without being asked. She did her hair the way her mother had taught her, pinned correctly, not the quick arrangement she used on ordinary mornings. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand for a moment. She looked like a woman going somewhere important. That was enough. Downstairs, Gideon was already at the kitchen table. He'd been up a while the coffee was made and half drunk, and he had the look of a man who had also been lying awake and had given up on it earlier than she had. He looked at her when she came in, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't much to say that they hadn't already said. Poured her coffee. "The Harmon family is going," he said. "Bill Harmon told Pell yesterday. Said he wanted to hear for himself what Crow had to say. That's something. The Castillos, too, and the Denisons are riding in from the East Road." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. She knew what he was doing, taking inventory, the way he did before anything that required managing, building a picture of who would be in the room and what they were likely to do. She'd learned this about him. He processed uncertainty through information. The more he knew, the more he could work with. The things he couldn't know were the things that kept him up at night. "Going to be a full room," she said. Yes. She drank her coffee and thought about a full room. About 200 people in a settlement, most of whom had known Thomas, most of whom had formed opinions about her in the 11 months since his death, most of whom were now going to sit in Ezekiel Crow's meeting and decide what they thought. "Eli's going to stay with Dottie," she said. "Rose and Caleb are going," Gideon said. She looked at him. "They asked me," he said. "Both of them, Caleb especially." She thought about that, about Caleb, who was 10 years old, and had sat in the kitchen corner tearing cloth into strips and crying in her arms, and was now asking to come and watch the settlements decide what to do about his household. Something in her chest did a complicated thing. "All right," she said. They didn't talk much after that. They drank the coffee, and Dottie came down and made breakfast, and the children came down, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do, indifferent to whatever weight the people in them are carrying. The meeting was held in the settlement hall, the largest building in Red Hollow, used for everything from community suppers to the occasional traveling preacher to the twice-yearly council sessions where the road fund got argued over until someone's wife sent in food and the arguing stopped. It held perhaps 120 people in reasonable comfort. By the time Clara arrived with Gideon and the children, it was holding considerably more than that. She had not anticipated the smell of that many people in a winter-sealed building. She had not anticipated the noise, not loud, but present, the sustained murmur of a crowd that has been assembled for a purpose and is still deciding what it thinks about that purpose. She had not anticipated the way people turned when she walked in, the specific quality of that attention, not all of it hostile, but almost none of it neutral, kept her face still. She held Caleb and Rose to her right, and Gideon came in behind her, and they found places near the left wall, not at the front and not at the back, a position from which she could see the room, and the room could see her. Ezekiel Crow was already at the front. She had seen him at a distance before, at the store once, crossing the road on a wet afternoon in October, but she had not been in the same room with him until now. He was a man in his early 60s, well-built, with the particular physical confidence of someone who has not had reason to doubt their place in a room for a very long time. He had a rancher's weathered face and a lawyer's careful eyes, and he stood at the front of the hall with his thumbs in his vest pockets and watched people file in with the expression of a man who has set a table and is waiting for his guests to sit down. He looked at Clara. When she came in, she looked back at him. Neither of them looked away first. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to establish the terms of what was happening without a word being said. And then Crow turned to say something to the man beside him, and Clara turned to look at the room. Martha Vane was in the second row. She had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and the look of a woman who has been given a part in something she believes is important. Clara noticed 3 other women near her with similar expressions, the specific righteousness of people who have decided that decency is on their side, and the decision has simplified things considerably. On the other side of the room, Bill Harmon caught Clara's eye and gave her a brief, plain nod. Kind, that meant, "I'm here. I'm watching, I haven't decided anything yet." She took it for what it was, which was more than nothing. Ezekiel called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock. She had to give him this, a good speaker. Not theatrical would have been too obvious, too easy to dismiss. He spoke the way he moved, with a settled authority that suggested the weight of the words came from the facts themselves, and not from any effort on his part. He spoke about Red Hollow's founding principles. He spoke about the difficulty of maintaining a community of decent people in frontier conditions, where the absence of established institutions put more pressure on shared values than it would elsewhere. He spoke about the responsibility they all had to one another. He did not mention Clara by name for the first 10 minutes. When he got to her, he used the phrase "the current situation" at the Rourke Ranch with a particular careful delicacy that was more damning than any direct accusation, because it allowed each person in the room to fill in the specific content themselves, which meant each person filled it with whatever they found most disturbing. "I want to be clear," he said, in the tone of a man being scrupulously fair, "that I attribute no malice to anyone involved. I understand that Mr. Rourke acted in what he believed to be a charitable spirit. We are a community with standards, and when those standards are seen to be set aside even with good intentions, the community has an obligation to address it." Martha Vane was nodding. Several other people were nodding. Clara stood against the left wall with her hands at her sides and listened to a man describe the situation that had nearly killed her as a question of community standards, and she felt the anger she'd described to Gideon larger than her fear. Steadier, something she could work with. Gideon shifted beside her. She put her hand briefly on his arm. He stilled. "Not yet." Crow spoke for another 5 minutes. He laid out, with surgical precision, the case that Clara Whitmore's continued residence at the Rourke Ranch was a matter of community concern. He did not say she was a woman of loose character. He said that he was sure no one in the room would want to assume otherwise, which was a way of putting the thought in every mind in the room while maintaining complete deniability. When he finished, he asked if anyone to speak to the matter. Clara stepped away from the wall. She felt the room register it. The shift in attention, the collective breath. She walked to the open space at the front of the hall, not all the way to where Crow was standing, but far enough that everyone could see her. She didn't have a voice naturally built for public address. She was not loud, and she had never practiced it. But she had spent 32 years talking to people in small spaces where the words had to carry Anna exactly as far as they needed to, and no further. And she found that she could make the room quiet without raising her voice, simply by being very certain of what she was going to say. "I'd like to tell you what actually happened," she said. The room was quiet. "On the 3rd morning of the blizzard," she said, "I woke up and the fire was out. We had no more wood. The trail was buried. My son was 6 years old, and he was already cold. And I lay there under every blanket I owned. And I told myself I was going to figure something out, and the truth was, I didn't figure anything out, because I was too afraid to walk to the nearest neighbors and say I needed help." She paused. She let that sit. "I was afraid because I had spent my whole life being told that asking for help meant you'd failed. I was afraid of what people would say. I was afraid of the look on someone's face. So afraid of what this settlement would think of me that I lay in that cabin and let myself and my son come within an hour of dying from it. The room was very still. Gideon Rourke was a quarter-mile away, she said. He was the only person in Red Hollow who looked at my chimney that morning and understood what no smoke meant. He got on his horse in the worst of the blizzard, and he came. He broke my door down. He wrapped my son in his own coat. He carried us both through the snow to his house. She looked at Martha Vane, not with anger, with something more deliberate than anger. He didn't ask what I could give him in return. He didn't ask whether it would look right. One question, whether we were breathing. That was it. She looked back at the broader room. I am not a scandal. I am a woman who nearly died because I was more afraid of this settlement's opinion than I was of the cold. That is the truth of what happened. And if you're going to have a meeting about the moral standing of Red Hollow, I think that truth deserves to be in the room. He stopped. The silence lasted long enough to have texture. She could hear the fire in the stove at the back of the hall, the specific creak of the building settling in the cold. Then Gideon walked to the front. He didn't look at Crow. He looked at the room, not the way a man looks at a crowd he's performing for, but the way a man looks at people he has known for years and has something to say to directly. Most of you know me, he said. Most of you knew my wife. You know I'm not a man who does things carelessly. He paused. I brought Clara and her son into my home because they were going to die without a fire, and I was the only person who noticed. I kept them there because her roof was failing, and there was nowhere safe for them to go. He looked at Crow. That's the whole of it. Crow started to speak. I'm not done, Gideon said without raising his voice. Crow stopped. There's also the matter of a debt, Gideon said. A debt Thomas Whitmore owed to a man in this room, which has been compounding at terms that would not hold up under legal review on land, that the same man has been angling to acquire for 3 years at a price he sets himself. Quality of the silence changed. I'm not making an accusation, Gideon said. I'm asking a question. If the purpose of this meeting is the moral standing of Red Hollow, then I think the room should ask itself why the loudest voice on that subject is also the man who stands to profit most from the outcome. He let it land. Clara watched Crow's face. She watched the careful control slip, just slightly at the edges, not into anger, which she'd expected, but into something colder and more dangerous, which was the expression of a man recalculating. Bill Harmon stood up. He was a large man, a farmer from the east side of the valley, who had been in Red Hollow since its founding and had the kind of unhurried authority that came from physical size, combined with genuine fairness. He had not said anything yet. The room turned to him. I'd like to know more about this debt, he said. Not to Gideon. Crow. Crow's expression went through several rapid adjustments. This is hardly the forum for discussing private financial. You made it a public meeting, Harmon said. That cuts both ways. A woman near the back, Clara didn't know her. Someone's wife, someone's sister said, I'd like to know too. Quietly, but clearly. Another voice, what are the terms? Crow looked at the room. Clara could see him reading it the way she'd seen him read it when he walked in taking inventory, measuring. What he saw now was different from what he'd expected to see, and she could see him understanding that. The legal particulars of a private loan arrangement, he started. You brought us here to talk about private arrangements, Harmon said. You can't choose which ones. The murmur that moved through the room was not the one Crow had planned for. Clara could feel the shift, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. Kind of shift that happens in a room when people's assumptions get complicated faster than they can manage, when the story they came in with is no longer the only story available. Martha Vane was not nodding anymore. She was looking at Crow with the specific expression of someone who has just realized they might have been used as a tool and is working through what that means. Crow tried twice more to redirect the meeting. Both times Harmon, or someone else, pulled it back. A man named Delbert Watts, who had a small property on the South Road and had never said much at public meetings in Clara's memory, stood up and said plainly that he thought Crow had been setting loan terms designed to fail for years. And he wasn't the only one who thought so. This opened a door that Crow had not intended to open, and through it came 3 more people's who secret stories about Crow's lending practices, each one more specific than the last. The meeting did not end cleanly. Nothing like that ends cleanly. It dissolved, gradually, into smaller conversations, and then into the general business of people putting on their coats and filing out into the cold, and what it left behind was not a verdict exactly, but something more durable, the settled knowledge, in most of the room, that Ezekiel Crow had miscalculated, and that the woman he had tried to use as a prop in his performance had turned out to be something he hadn't accounted for. Clara stood near the door as people left. A woman she knew slightly, Ellen Breck, whose husband ran the mills, stopped and took both her hands and said, "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. In February when it was cold. I should have come." Clara looked at her. The apology was real. She could tell. "Next time," Clara said, "that's all I can ask." Ellen nodded and went out. Bill Harmon shook her hand on his way by and said, "Good," which was a complete sentence when Bill Harmon said it. Crow left without speaking to her. He walked past with 2 men from the council, talking in a low voice that had the quality of someone already rebuilding, already working out which parts of the evening could be salvaged, which relationships could be repaired. He did not look at her. She thought that was telling. She found Caleb near the back of the hall, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the last of the crowd thin out. She went and stood beside him. "That was good," he said. He sounded surprised, the way people sound when something exceeds what they were prepared for. "It wasn't clean," she said. "It was messy and loud, and I don't know what all of those people went home thinking. But you said the true thing." "I tried to." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd been working out. "That's what Mama used to say, that you had to say the true thing, even when it was—" He stopped, started again. "She said the true thing was always smaller than you expected. You built it up in your head to be enormous, and then you said it, and it was just words." Clara looked at him. "She was right," Clara said. "It's always smaller once it's out." He nodded again, and they went to find Gideon and Rose. The letter from the lawyer in Hartfield arrived 9 days after the meeting. His name was Ambrose Kettler, and he wrote with the dense precision of someone who charged by the hour, and was also, underneath the professional language, genuinely interested in the legal problem she'd laid out. Confirmed that the compound interest terms Crow had applied to Thomas's loan were, at minimum, legally questionable under the territory statutes and, in his assessment, probably unenforceable as written. He said that the abandonment claim Crow might attempt to make would be weak, given that Clara had not voluntarily left the property but had been displaced by an emergency weather event. There was precedent on this. He cited it, and that the assessment value, if it had been set by a party with a financial interest in the outcome, was challengeable. He also said he could take the case, and he named his fee. Clara read the letter twice, and then read it a 3rd time with more attention in tin to the specific legal language. She had not had much occasion to read legal correspondence before, but she found that when the words meant something real to her, she could work through them. She went to Gideon's office. He was there, at the desk. He looked up. She put the letter on the desk in front of him without speaking, picked it up and read it. She watched his face while he read the careful attention, the slight narrowing around the eyes when he got to the fee, the thing that loosened slightly when he got to the part about the terms being unenforceable. "He thinks you can win," Gideon said. "He thinks I have a strong case. That's not the same thing, but it's better than nothing. Fee, I have the deposit from Eleanor Hargrove, and I had a second letter yesterday. A woman in Caldwell County wants 2 quilts for her granddaughter's wedding gifts. I can cover the retainer from those 2 orders, if I'm careful." He looked at her over the letter. "You've been managing this whole time," he said. "On your own." "I've been managing. With your advance and your contacts and Pell's information." She paused. "It's not the same as on my own, but it's mine." He set the letter down, turned it over. then back, as if the paper itself contained something he was still working out. "Write to him," he said. "Retain him." "I already wrote the letter. I came to tell you I was sending it." A pause.
Not to ask?
"Tell," she said. "You put me in contact with him. You should know what I'm doing with that." He looked at her. She could see him finding the line, the place where his instinct to manage things ran up against the reality of who she was and what she was doing. And she could see him choosing deliberately to step back from that line. He said. She picked up the letter and went to write her reply to Ambrose Kettler. April came. It arrived without fanfare, the way April arrives in that part of the country, not a proclamation, but an accumulation. 1 degree warmer than the day before, and then another. And then a morning when the air had a smell in it that hadn't been there since October. The trail down from the hills opened on the 8th of April, and Pell rode up to the Whitmore cabin on the 9th, with 2 other hands to assess the repair. They came back with the news that it was worse than they'd thought and better than they'd feared. Cracked rafters would need full replacement, as expected. The sagging corner needed to be stripped back to the frame and rebuilt from scratch. But the frame itself was sound. Thomas had built the cabin with more care than he'd built most other things in his life, and the foundation was solid. Pell's estimate was 3 weeks of work with a full crew, weather cooperating. He'd already talked to a man in the settlement who did this kind of thing, and had given him a rough number. Clara looked at the number. Then she went back to her quilts. The Eleanor Hargrove quilt was 3/4 done. It was, in Clara's private assessment, the best work she'd ever done, not because she was showing off for a paying customer, but because having a specific person in mind for a quilt, a specific occasion, made the work more particular. She thought about Eleanor's daughter getting married, and about what she'd want to sleep under on the first cold night of a new marriage, and the thinking changed how she cut and what she chose. Rose was her constant companion through the project. She was getting better, noticeably, genuinely better, not the polite improvement of a child trying to please an adult, but the real improvement of someone whose hands were learning something. Her seams were even now, mostly. Her eye for color arrangement had turned out to be excellent from the start, better than Clara's own at that age. You should keep a sampler, Clara told her one afternoon, of everything you learn. A piece from each technique, so you have a record of it. Rose looked up. Because someday someone will ask you to teach them, and you'll want to show them how far you've come. Rose thought about this. Do you have one? I did. I left it behind when Thomas and I moved here. She smoothed a seam with her thumb. I regret that. Don't leave yours behind. Rose went back to her work, and Clara could see her thinking about it, the idea of a permanent record, something that would last. Children who have lost something important often become unexpectedly attached to the idea of things that endure. Caleb had quietly begun coming in for an hour most afternoons. He didn't sew, that was a bridge still too far, for a 10-year-old boy navigating the social politics of his own self-image. But he'd developed a genuine interest in the structural logic of quilt patterns, the geometry of how pieces fit together. And he and Clara had several long conversations about why some patterns lay flat and others buckled, why the grain of the fabric mattered, how you could predict the behavior of a finished quilt from decisions made at the cutting stage. He approached it the way he approached everything he was genuinely interested in, with total seriousness and no self-consciousness about the seriousness. It's like engineering, he said one afternoon. Exactly like engineering, she agreed. He nodded, satisfied, as if this had resolved something for him. The second order was for the widow in Caldwell County, whose name was Harriet Moss. She wanted 2 lap quilts in a log cabin pattern, one for each granddaughter, to be given as wedding gifts, 4 months apart. Her letter was warm and specific about what she wanted. She'd included a swatch of fabric from each girl's childhood dresses, wanting them incorporated into the design, which Clara found immediately familiar and immediately moving. She wrote back and confirmed the commission and the price and the timeline, and then she sat with the 2 small fabric swatches for a while before pinning them to the working board above her sewing area. By mid-April, she had 3 commissions confirmed, and a 4th that was close. A woman in the next valley, who had heard from Eleanor Hargrove's sister, who had heard from someone at the Castillo Ranch, who had heard, and the network of it was becoming something she could see the shape of, the way you see the shape of a quilt when the pieces are still separate and the pattern is still mostly in your head. Word traveled differently than she'd expected. She'd assumed it would travel the way goods traveled through commerce, through formal channels. Instead, it traveled the way useful. Information always traveled in frontier settlements, through women talking to each other about practical things. One woman told another that there was a quilter in Red Hollow who did exceptional work at a fair price, and who incorporated personal fabric into the design if you brought it to her, which was the specific detail that caught people, because it was unusual, and because it meant something. Gideon watched all of this with an expression she was learning to read, which was contained satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who had seen an outcome coming, and is pleased that it arrived but is not going to make a production of having predicted it. He brought in the supply wagon one afternoon with a package of fabric from the dry goods merchant in Millhaven. An order she'd placed 2 weeks earlier, good cotton in 3 colors she'd been running low on. He set it on the kitchen table without comment. She looked at him. "I was going to town anyway," he said. She said nothing. She opened the package and checked the fabric against the samples she'd ordered from, and it was right. All of it correct, which meant he'd delivered the samples along with the order and made sure it was done properly. "Thank you," she said. It was on the way. She let him have the fiction of it. The Ezekiel Crow situation resolved in the way that legal situations often resolve, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a series of letters and a quiet capitulation that was dressed up as something else. Kettler wrote in late April to say that Crow's representative had made contact to discuss the loan terms. This had the precise smell of a man who has been told by someone with more legal knowledge than him that his position is weaker than he thought. Discussion over 2 more letters resulted in an agreement to recalculate the debt at a simple interest rate that was, while still not negligible, approximately half what the compounded amount had been, and critically within Clara's capacity to actually pay over time. Kettler's letter informing her of this was almost pleased. He wrote that the outcome was as good as he'd hoped for, and somewhat better than he'd expected, and that in his professional experience, men like Crow generally preferred quiet settlements to public legal proceedings, particularly when the public mood was not currently running in their favor. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table. Dottie poured 2 cups of tea and sat down across from her, and Clara handed her the letter, and Dottie read it and set it down and said, "Good," in the same tone of voice she used for everything she found genuinely satisfying. "I still have to pay it," Clara said, "the remaining amount. And you will. It'll take a while. Most things worth doing take a while." Dottie picked up her cup. "You have orders. You have a business. You have a plan." She paused. Thomas didn't have a plan. He had hope and good intentions, and that's a different thing. Clara looked at her. "I liked Thomas," Dottie said firmly, in the tone of someone who wants to be clear that criticism and affection are not incompatible. He was a good man with a good heart who couldn't see around corners. You see around corners. I didn't see the loan. You didn't know to look. That's different from not being able to. Dottie put her cup down. "You'll look now." Clara nodded. She sat at the table for a while after Dottie went back to her work. She sat with the letter and the tea, and she thought about Thomas and about the debt he'd carried alone, and about the particular tragedy of a man who had been too proud to tell his wife the truth and had died with the truth still in him. She thought about pride her own, his, the whole settlement's, and about what it cost and what it protected, and whether the protection was ever worth the cost. She thought about the cabin which Pell's crew had started repairing 2 weeks ago. She thought about going back to it. The thought was complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had spent the first month at the Rourke Ranch, calculating the days until she could go back, until the trail opened, until the roof was fixed, until she had a legitimate, practical reason to return to her own land. Cabin had been her independence, her autonomy, the proof that she could manage. She had held on to the idea of returning to it the way you hold on to a belief that's costing you something, because letting it go would mean admitting that what replaced it was better. Something had changed, gradually in the way she thought about it. She had not decided anything. She was clear about that with herself. Nothing had been said, nothing had been offered, and she was not the kind of woman who built plans around things that hadn't been said. But she was also honest enough with herself to admit that the Rourke Ranch felt in the mornings when she came down to the kitchen and found coffee already made and Dottie already talking, and the children's footsteps overhead like something she recognized. Not hers, not yet, maybe not ever, but familiar in the way of something that has been worn in the right places. She wrote to Kettler and confirmed the settlement. Then she went upstairs to work on Eleanor Hargrove's quilt, which was almost done. Eleanor Hargrove quilt left on a wagon on the first warm Friday in May. Clara had rolled it carefully in clean cloth and packed it in a wooden box that Gideon had made. She hadn't asked him to. She'd mentioned she needed something to protect it for transport, and the box had appeared 2 days later without discussion. She'd enclosed a short letter explaining the pattern and the care instructions, and a small envelope of leftover fabric from the commission in case a repair was ever needed. She stood in the yard and watched the wagon take it away, and felt the particular complex emptiness of finishing something that had taken a long time and mattered. Rose stood beside her. "Will she like it?" Rose said. "Think so. What if she doesn't? Then she'll have a beautiful quilt that she doesn't like as much as she expected. Still a beautiful quilt." Rose considered this with her characteristic seriousness. A good way to think about it. "My mother taught me that. She said you make the best thing you're capable of making, and then you let it go. Once it leaves your hands, it belongs to whoever has it." They stood in the warm May air and watched the wagon reach the end of the drive and turn south. "I want to make one," Rose said. "A whole one. By myself. Then we'll start planning it." "Can I design the pattern?" "You can try. It's harder than it looks." "I know," Rose said. "I'm going to do it anyway." Clara looked at her, at this 8-year-old girl with her mother's face and her father's eyes and the specific, fierce quietness that was entirely her own, and felt something so large and particular that it didn't have a clean name. "I know you are," she said. They went back inside. Gideon found her in the sitting room that evening. He came in the way he always came in without announcement, the way a person moves through their own house when they've stopped performing being at home and are just actually at home. He sat down in the chair across from her, which was unusual. He generally stood when he had something to say, as if sitting committed him to a duration he wasn't sure about. He sat down. Clara set aside the pattern. She'd been sketching the beginning of Rose's design project, which was already ambitious, in ways that were going to require some serious conversation about the relationship between creative vision and available fabric. She waited. Gideon looked at his own hands. He was not a man who fidgeted, but he was doing something close to it, not quite restless, but not quite still, working up to something. "The cabin is going to be done next week," he said. "Pell says they'll finish the corner rebuild by Wednesday, if the weather holds." "I know, he told me Tuesday." So he stopped. She looked at him steadily. "You'll be able to go back," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The fire made its small sounds. The house around them was quiet with the particular quality of quiet. That means the children are in bed and the day's over, and there's no more business to conduct and no more tasks to perform. And what's left is whatever is actually there when you take all of that away. "I don't want you to go back," he said. He said it plainly, without preamble or architecture around it, the way he said things when he'd run out of patience with managing how they sounded. Just the fact of it, laid on the table. Clara didn't respond immediately. She sat with it, and let it be what it was, not a question, not a request, not a demand. Just a man saying a true thing to a woman who had taught him, over the course of one long winter, that true things were smaller once they were out. I know, she said. I'm not. He stopped. Tried again. I'm not asking you to stay because you need to. You don't. You've made sure of that. He paused. I'm asking you to consider it because I. Another stop. He looked at her with the expression of someone who is very used to having the right words for practical things and has run completely out of them for this. Because the house is different when you're in it. And I'm different. And the children are. I know, she said again more softly. Do you? He looked at her steadily. Because I need to know if you know, Clara. I need to know that you understand what I'm saying. She sat with the weight of the moment, with everything the winter had been, and everything that had changed in it, and everything that hadn't, and all the ways that she, specifically, had arrived here as a practical necessity, and was still here because of something else entirely. I understand what you're saying, she said. The fire settled. I'm not going to answer you tonight, she said. Not because I don't. I need to answer you on my own terms. When I'm not answering out of necessity or gratitude or anything else that isn't just, she paused. I need the cabin to be finished. I need to go back to it once, so I know I'm choosing to leave it. Do you understand? He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I understand. She picked up Rose's pattern sketch again. He stayed in the chair by the fire, and she worked, and neither of them said anything else. And the fire burned down slowly. And outside the May night moved over the valley and over the hills and over the small repaired cabin on the ridge that was waiting to find out whether it was a home or just a building. The cabin was finished on a Wednesday. Pell told her at breakfast, the same way he told her most practical things briefly, without ceremony, with the specific plainness of a man who respects the person he's talking to enough not to dress information up. Corner was rebuilt. The 2 rafters were replaced. The roof was sound. She could go back whenever she was ready. She went on Thursday morning. She didn't ask anyone to come with her. She told Dottie where she was going and kissed Eli on the top of his head and walked up the trail alone, the way she'd wanted to, not because she needed to prove something to anyone else, but because she needed to know what she felt when she got there without another person's presence shaping the feeling. The trail was clear and muddy from the spring thaw, and the walk took 20 minutes, and she arrived at the cabin on a cool May morning, with the new wood still pale against the weathered gray of the old frame. She stood outside for a moment, then she opened the door and went in. Cold inside. Not the killing cold of November, just the ordinary cold of a space that hasn't had a fire in months. Tin was still under the floorboard. She checked, because she'd wondered. $11 and some coins. She put the board back. The table was where Thomas had left it. The 2 chairs. The bed frame, with no mattress, because she'd brought the mattress to Gideon's, in the wagon, and it hadn't come back. She stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at it for a long time. This was the place she had almost died in. This was also the place where she had lived for 7 years, where Thomas had come in from the cold every evening, where Eli had been born on an August night so hot that even the memory of it felt wrong in a May morning's chill. The same place could hold all of that at once. It didn't have to choose. She understood, standing there, that she had needed to come back not to decide whether to return, but to finish something. To stand in the place where she had chosen pride over survival and survived anyway, and say out loud to herself, not to Gideon, not to the settlement, just to herself, that she wasn't that person anymore, not because she had fixed the pride. She still had it, probably always would. But she had learned that the pride and the asking could coexist, that needing help and being capable were not opposites, that you could accept warmth and still be the one who gave it. That was the thing the winter had actually taught her. Not survival, not resilience, which was a word people used when they meant something they couldn't quite name. Just that. She stayed for an hour. She opened the window to let the spring air through. She looked at the new wood in the corner and put her hand on it and felt how solid it was. Then she closed the window and the door and walked back down the trail to the Rourke Ranch. Gideon was in the yard when she came back. He was doing nothing particular, a rare condition for him, and she understood that he had probably been doing nothing particular for the last hour in a position from which he could see the trail. She walked up to him. "Well," he said. "It's a good cabin," she said. "Pell's crew did good work." He waited. "I'm not going back to it," she said. "Not to live, not now." She held his eyes. "If that offer is still open." He looked at her the way he had looked at the quilt top, that first night registering something real, something that had cost more than it appeared to, something he hadn't expected to feel as much as he did. "It's open," he said. "I want to be clear about what I'm saying," she said. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere to go. I'm staying because I want to be here, because Eli is happy here, and I am. I'm better here than I've been in a long time. And because I think." She stopped. She was not accustomed to saying this kind of thing, and she was not going to pretend to be. "Think you and I are something that makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. "I asked you to stay," he said. "Night in the sitting room. That was I should have been clearer. I wasn't asking you to stay and help with the children or run the household, or because it was practical." He paused. "I was asking you because I love you. I've been working up to saying that plainly since January, and I'm saying it now." She looked at him. "I know," she said, for the third time in this particular conversation's history. "I love you too. I've been working up to that since February, and I'm saying it now too." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Something shorter and more involuntary, something that came out of him before he could manage it. She thought it might be the most unguarded sound she'd ever heard him make. "Then stay," he said. "I'm staying," she said. They got married in June, on a morning when the light came down through the valley, the way it does in early summer, not harsh, not dramatic, just clean and honest and plenty of it. The whole settlement came, or most of it, and the ones who had said the worst things in February came too, because that is also something true about people. They are capable of reconsidering, if given the facts and enough time. Clara wore the gray dress with the small buttons she had found it at the back of the dry goods store in town, close enough to what she'd wanted that she bought it without trying it on. Fit well enough. Rose fixed the hem the night before, with stitches that were even and tight, and that Clara examined afterwards and said were better than hers, which was the truth. Caleb stood beside his father and did not cry, which took visible effort, and when Clara saw him working at it, she looked away to give him the privacy of the attempt. Eli fell asleep during the outdoor supper afterward, under a quilt that Rose and Clara had made together, and Gideon carried him inside without waking him. That was the image Clara held afterward, of everything that had changed. Gideon Rourke carrying her sleeping son, easy and careful, the way you carry a child you've already decided is yours. The years that followed were not simple. Nothing honest is. The debt to Crow was paid in full by the following spring, every dollar accounted for, and the paper came back to Clara through Kettler's office, and she burned it in the kitchen stove, while Dottie watched with the satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time for a specific thing to happen. Ezekiel Crow never recovered his standing in Red Hollow, entirely not because anyone ran him out, but because trust, once publicly complicated, recalibrates itself quietly and permanently in the way of a river that has found a new channel. Clara's quilting business grew to the point where she had more orders than she could fill alone, and she trained 2 women from the settlement to help her, which meant the tradition moved outward from her the way it had moved to her, from woman to woman, carried forward in the hands. Rose made her first complete quilt at age 11. The pattern was her own design, more complicated than it had any right to be, for a first solo effort, with a center medallion that radiated outward in alternating rings of warm and cool color, and it lay flat. Clara told her honestly was the real achievement. Rose gave it to her grandmother in Millhaven, and the grandmother wrote back a letter that Rose kept for years. Caleb grew into a man who was good at ranching, and better at the engineering of fences that were built correctly the first time, systems for water distribution that other ranchers copied, kind of practical intelligence that made things last. He was not easy to know, which was true of both his parents in different ways, but he was reliable and fair, and the people who worked for him knew the difference. Eli grew up in the same house as Rose and Caleb and grew up understanding, the way children do who are loved by more than one set of hands, that a family is something you build together rather than something you're simply born into. Gideon never entirely stopped being a man who processed his feelings through work and practical action rather than words. Clara never entirely stopped being a woman who would rather struggle alone for 20 minutes too long before asking for help. They knew these things about each other and worked around them. The way you work around the specific load-bearing walls in a house that was built before you got there, you know where they are, and you stop trying to take them down and you build around them instead. There was a winter, 6 years after that first blizzard, when the snow came down hard again, and Clara woke before dawn and looked out the window at the falling white. She lay there for a moment and thought about November, about the tin under the floorboard, about $11 and pride and a chimney that stopped smoking. Gideon woke beside her. "What is it?" "Snow," she said. "Bad one." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll ride out in the morning," he said. "Check the Pearson place. That old couple, they were low on wood last I saw." "I know," she said. "I'll go with you." He looked at her in the dark. She looked back. That was the thing nobody tells you about the warmth you receive in the worst moment of your life. It doesn't just save you. Changes what you do with the rest of it. You spend the years afterward looking at chimneys, watching for the ones that have gone cold, riding out before anyone has to ask. You become the person who noticed, not because it makes you a good person in some clean and simple way, because you know what it cost when no one came, and you know what it meant when someone did, and you carry both of those things in you for the rest of your life. And the carrying is the whole point. That is the story of Clara Whitmore, who became Clara Rourke in June of a year the settlement remembered for its warmth, and who never once stood at a window in winter without looking for smoke.